The convent halls are always quiet at night, but some silences weigh more heavily than others. Even now, after decades in these walls, there are nights when the silence feels alive, pressing against me like a reminder of the secret I have carried for most of my life. I have learned to pray through it, to breathe through it, to let the shadows of the past drift across my memory without consuming me. Yet sometimes the silence asks me to speak. Tonight is one of those nights. I was not always the woman in a habit, guiding others in faith, teaching young girls how to find strength in prayer. Long before I wore this veil, I was a child who believed the world was safe. I believed that the people closest to you would always protect you. That belief was broken in a way that no child should ever endure, and its fragments have followed me ever since. It is difficult to begin, not because the memories have faded, but because they are etched too sharply. For years I buried them under obedience and service, convincing myself that silence was strength. But silence, I would later learn, can also be a prison. My name is Esther Cole, and this is the story I never thought I would tell aloud. If my voice trembles as you hear it, know that it is not weakness, but the weight of opening wounds I kept hidden for so long. I grew up in a modest home, surrounded by the ordinary rhythms of a simple family life. Ours was not a wealthy household, but we had enough to keep food on the table and clothes on our backs. My mother often hummed hymns while cooking, and I can still picture the lace curtains fluttering in the summer breeze as she worked. Those little details seemed so secure, so ordinary, and for a time I believed that ordinary was forever. My grandfather was the figure I admired most. To everyone, he was the wise, dependable elder. He told stories by the fire, carved small wooden toys for me, and seemed like the anchor of our family. I looked at him with the kind of trust only a child can give, never doubting his words or his smile. In my eyes, he was a guardian. I had no reason to imagine that behind those eyes lived something capable of breaking me. When I was still very young, there were subtle moments that I brushed aside, an extra hand lingering on my shoulder, a closeness that made me uneasy. Children often lack the language for unease, and so I told myself it was affection. I told myself I was imagining things, that it was nothing. I did not know how to listen to the alarm bells my heart tried to ring. As the years passed, the silences in our home began to grow louder. The kind of silence when someone looks away instead of asking a question. The silence when you want to cry out, but swallow the words instead. I wore my silence like a cloak, pretending to be the same cheerful girl my family knew, while inside I was folding into myself. At church, I prayed more fervently than other children my age. I prayed for protection, for escape, for someone to notice the shadows in my eyes. The saints on the stained glass windows seemed to look back at me with pity, but they could not speak, and I did not dare to. For a long time, I told myself that if I simply stayed quiet, if I carried the secret alone, the world would keep spinning, and my family would remain whole. I thought silence would protect everyone. What I did not understand then was that silence was protecting the wrong person. The truth has a way of pressing against the edges of silence until it finally breaks through. My breaking point came when my body could no longer contain the pain, when the bleeding began, and my voice, after so many months of captivity, finally tore free in a scream for help. But that is a moment I will return to later. For now, what you must know is that this story is not simply one of sorrow. It is a story of survival, of faith tested and remade, of scars that never disappeared, yet did not destroy me. If you stay with me through these chapters, you will walk the path I walked, from the quiet beginnings of my childhood, through the valley of shadows where silence nearly swallowed me, to the place where I found healing in unexpected ways. My story is heavy, but I share it now because someone out there might be carrying their own silence, and I want them to know they are not alone. Tonight, I open the door on the past. Tonight, I begin to tell the story of the girl I once was, and the woman I became. Before the shadows fell over my life, there was a season of light. When I look back now, I cling to those early memories because they remind me that I was once untouched by sorrow, that joy was not foreign to me. It is important for me to tell you about that innocence, because without it, the depth of the fall cannot be understood. I was born into a modest family that lived by simple values. Our home stood on the edge of a small town where neighbors knew each other by name and Sundays were marked by the tolling of church bells. The air carried the scent of fresh bread from the bakery down the street, and the sound of children's laughter echoed in the alleys until dusk. To most, it was an ordinary place, but for me, as a child, it was the whole world. My mother was the heart of our household. She had a voice that could soothe me even on the hardest days and a way of turning the plainest meal into something comforting. I can still remember her hands dusted with flour, shaping loaves while humming old hymns. My father was often away, working long hours to provide for us, but his rare smiles and the warmth of his embrace when he returned home were treasures I held close. And then there was my grandfather. In those early years, he was the pillar everyone leaned on. To my eyes, he seemed larger than life, a man with stories that stretched back through generations, tales of hardship and triumph that he told by the fireplace on cold evenings. He carved small wooden crosses and rosaries, giving them as gifts to me and my cousins. His weathered face carried lines that I mistook for wisdom, and when he called me his little lamb, I felt special. That trust I placed in him was pure and complete, the kind of trust only a child can give without hesitation. School in those days was a mixture of discipline and laughter. I remember chalk dust on my fingers, the creak of old desks, and the thrill of learning to read. I was quick with words, always eager to please my teachers. At recess, I played jump rope with the other girls or skipped stones in the creek that ran behind the schoolyard. My world was small, but it was secure. I had no reason to imagine that danger could live so close to home. Sundays were the highlight of my week. We rose early, polished our shoes, and walked to church together. The stained glass windows glowed with sunlight, painting the pews with colors that felt almost heavenly. I would sit beside my mother, holding her hand, and gaze up at the crucifix. Back then, faith was something simple and unquestioned, a source of wonder rather than a refuge from pain. I remember thinking that if heaven could be so beautiful, then the world must surely be good. There were small joys that filled my childhood days. The taste of ripe berries picked from the bushes near our home, the soft clucking of hens in the yard, the thrill of running barefoot through the grass in summer until the soles of my feet were green. At night I would curl beneath handmade quilts, listening to the distant hoot of owls, feeling safe. These are the memories I cling to, reminders of who I was before everything changed. What strikes me most now is how invisible the line was between innocence and the loss of it. Looking back, I can see hints I missed then. The times when my grandfather's hand lingered too long on my shoulder, or when his compliments carried a weight I didn't understand. But as a child, I brushed it aside. He was family. He was supposed to love me. Love, in my young mind, was simple and unquestionable. I share these details not to dwell on the sweetness of the past, but to show the contrast that defined my story. Light existed before the darkness, and perhaps that is why the darkness felt so unbearable. I had known peace. I had known safety, and that made the betrayal of it all the heavier. The days of my early youth seemed endless. Summers stretched wide with games and laughter. Winters brought evenings of cocoa and stories by the fire. I trusted freely, smiled easily, and believed that life would always be that way. My heart was open, unguarded, vulnerable in the way only a child's heart can be. It is strange to think of that girl now. She feels like a stranger, someone I once knew but lost along the way. Yet she lives in me still, buried beneath the scars. Sometimes, when I hear the sound of church bells drifting through the convent air, I am transported back to those mornings, walking hand in hand with my mother, my shoes polished, my heart untroubled. For a brief moment, I remember what it felt like to be whole. But innocence, once lost, cannot be restored. It can only be remembered, cherished in fragments. And as I draw this memory forward, I know it leads to the place where everything changed. The day when the trust I had in my grandfather, the trust I thought unbreakable, was shattered forever. That day did not come all at once. It crept in like a shadow, subtle at first, until it consumed everything. I will take you there, step by step, but not before letting you see what was taken from me. For to understand my pain, you must first understand the joy that was stolen. Childhood innocence often fades slowly, as though time itself sands away its edges. For me, it was not time that ended my innocence, but one moment, sharp and sudden, like glass breaking in the night. That first fracture is still as vivid in my memory as if it happened yesterday. It began in the smallest of ways, so small that I might have ignored it if not for the feeling it left behind. One afternoon, my grandfather asked me to help him in the shed behind the house. I was eager to be useful, eager to please him as I always did. The shed smelled of oil and wood shavings, dust motes floating in narrow beams of sunlight. He handed me a small box of nails, guiding my hands with his. At first it seemed ordinary, but then his grip lingered too long, his touch settling in a way that made me stiffen. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was being silly. After all, this was the man who carved me toys, the man I trusted. I forced a smile and continued helping, but that uneasy feeling did not leave me. It followed me through supper, through bedtime prayers, until I lay staring at the ceiling, uncertain and restless. Children rarely have the words for their discomfort, so I told myself a story, that he was only being affectionate, that my fear was unfounded. It was easier to explain it away than to believe something could be wrong with the person I had trusted most. Over the next weeks, more moments came. A hand resting too heavily on my shoulder, an embrace that lingered when no one else was around. Compliments about how much I was growing up, said in a tone I didn't recognize. Each time I tried to dismiss it, but deep inside a warning began to take root. I prayed more often, kneeling by my bed, whispering words I didn't even fully understand. Lord, keep me safe. Please keep everything good. The day the fracture truly appeared was warm, though I remember shivering. My mother had gone into town to visit a neighbor, leaving me at home. My grandfather was supposed to be napping, but instead he called me into the kitchen. I obeyed, expecting nothing unusual. He spoke to me softly, his voice almost gentle, but there was something in it that made my stomach twist. He told me I was becoming a young lady, that I was different now. I laughed nervously, trying to step back, but his hand closed around my wrist. That grip changed everything. In that instant, I knew the affection I thought I understood was something else entirely. My heart pounded as I tried to pull away, muttering that I had chores to finish. His smile chilled me more than any shout could have. It was calm, assured, as though he believed I could never refuse him. I managed to free myself and ran to my room, bolting the door. My hands shook so badly I could barely turn the lock. I sat there for what felt like hours, listening for footsteps in the hall. That night I barely slept. My body felt foreign to me, heavy with fear, as though I had stepped into a world where nothing was safe. The next morning he acted as though nothing had happened. At breakfast he complimented my braids, offered me jam for my bread, and laughed with my cousins as though the moment in the kitchen had been a dream. But it had not been a dream. Something inside me had cracked and I could not mend it. I began changing in small ways. I avoided being alone in the same room with him. I kept my eyes on the floor whenever he spoke to me. My laughter grew less frequent, replaced by a cautious silence. My mother asked if I was feeling unwell, but I shook my head. How could I explain something I didn't fully understand? A few days later came the moment that scarred me most deeply. I was washing dishes when he came up behind me, close enough to feel his breath on my neck. His hand reached for me again, and this time I could not pretend it was innocent. I froze, every nerve in my body screaming to run. When I tried to move away, his voice hardened, warning me not to tell anyone. "No one will believe you," he said. Those words branded themselves into me, heavier than the touch itself. That night I bled. At first I thought it was just my monthly cycle arriving early, but it was sharper, deeper, accompanied by a pain that stole my breath. I curled up on my bed, pressing my hands against my body, trembling with fear. The sheets were stained, and I scrubbed them in secret, terrified that my mother would see. My heart ached, not only with the pain, but with the knowledge that I was trapped in a silence too heavy to carry and too dangerous to break. I remember kneeling by the window, whispering prayers into the darkness. I asked God why the man I trusted most had become my fear, why I could not speak, why my voice felt locked inside me. I begged him to send someone, anyone, who could see what I could not say. But the night remained silent, and so did I. From that moment, my childhood was no longer my own. Fear became my shadow. I wore baggy clothes to hide myself, avoided friends, and stopped smiling in photographs. Teachers asked what was wrong, but I only lowered my eyes. My silence became both my shield and my cage. That first fracture may seem small in the telling. Just a touch, just a threat, just a moment. But it was the beginning of an unraveling that would stretch on, pulling me deeper into despair. It taught me that trust could be poisoned, that love could be twisted, and that even in a house filled with family, a child could feel utterly alone. And though I wanted desperately to believe it would never happen again, I already knew in the marrow of my bones that it was only the beginning. After that first fracture, the silence became my constant companion. It wrapped itself around me like a heavy cloak I could not remove, suffocating and yet, in some twisted way, protecting me. I believed that if I never spoke of what was happening, I could preserve the fragile order of our family. My silence felt like a shield, but in truth, it was a cage that grew smaller with every passing day. My grandfather's warning rang in my ears constantly. No one will believe you. For a child, those words were more powerful than chains. I loved my parents, but I doubted they could see past his mask of kindness. To the world, he was a respected elder, a man admired for his wisdom. To me, he had become a shadow lurking behind every corner of our home. I convinced myself that if I revealed his cruelty, the blame would somehow fall on me. I began to change. The cheerful girl who once ran barefoot through the grass vanished. I dressed in loose, dull clothing, desperate to hide my body. I cut my hair shorter than I liked, hoping it would make me less noticeable. My laughter disappeared, replaced by a quiet stillness. Teachers at school noticed my slipping grades and the darkness under my eyes, but when they asked what was wrong, I only shook my head. I carried his secret as though it were stitched into my skin. At church, the place that had always felt sacred, I sat stiff and restless. The stained glass that once filled me with awe now felt like eyes staring into me, seeing what I dared not say. When the priest spoke of sin, my chest tightened with guilt that was not mine to bear. I whispered prayers begging God to forgive me, though I could not name what I thought needed forgiving. That was the cruelest part. I was a child made to feel like the sinner, while the real sin hid behind a grandfather's gentle smile. My mother noticed changes but misread them. She thought I was moody, thought I was slipping into the stubbornness of adolescence. She scolded me for being distant, urged me to be more grateful for the home and family I had. Her words pierced me, though she meant no harm. I wanted to cry out, "Look closer, see me, save me!" But the fear of shattering everything held my tongue still. When I locked myself in my room, pushing furniture against the door, it was not rebellion, but survival. He laughed when he discovered it. I can still hear his voice mocking me. Locks won't save you, little one. This is my house, too. That sentence made my stomach twist with dread. I realized then that I had no true refuge. My own home had become a prison. The routine of his cruelty carved itself into my life. He knew when my mother would be gone delivering laundry, when my father was away for work, when neighbors would not drop by. Each absence of safety became his opportunity. I lived counting minutes, measuring days by when I might be trapped again. Even the sound of his footsteps in the hallway made my heart race. Sleep no longer brought rest. Nightmares crept in, replaying the moments I could not control, twisting them into endless loops. Sometimes I woke with a scream caught in my throat, trembling so hard I thought my bones might rattle apart. My pillow was damp with tears I could never explain. In the morning I forced a smile, but my reflection in the mirror betrayed me. Hollow eyes, lips pressed tight, as though even in sleep I was guarding a secret. At school I pulled away from friends. Their innocent chatter about games, dances, and small crushes felt like a world I no longer belonged to. They could talk freely of joy. I carried only silence. I began skipping meals, my appetite gone. The emptiness inside me felt like a punishment I deserved, though I could not say why. There were times I almost spoke. Once my teacher knelt beside my desk, gently asking why my essays had grown so dark. I opened my mouth, but my grandfather's voice echoed louder. No one will believe you. Shame clamped down on me, and I mumbled something about being tired. Another time, my mother brushed my hair and commented on how thin it had become. Her kindness nearly cracked me open, but then I remembered his threat, and I stayed silent. Silence is not merely the absence of sound, it is the suffocation of the soul. It teaches you to doubt your own worth, to question whether you even deserve to be heard. I carried that silence everywhere, like a shadow that darkened every step. The longer it continued, the more it consumed me. I stopped praying for rescue, convinced that even God had turned away. Instead, I prayed for numbness, for the ability to feel nothing. Pain I could handle, but hope felt dangerous. Hope meant disappointment when no one came to save me. Yet even in that prison of silence, a spark of defiance flickered. Each time I pushed my dresser against the door, each time I buried my face in my pillow to stifle a cry, I was resisting in the only ways I knew. My silence was my shield, though it also chained me. I thought if I bore it quietly, the rest of my family would stay whole, and perhaps one day it would end. But silence does not end suffering. It deepens it. It makes the shadows bolder. And in the depths of that silence, my body began to give way, signaling that the secret could no longer be contained. The day was coming when I would collapse under the weight of it all, when my silence would be broken not by choice, but by necessity. Silence can stretch a long time, but it cannot stretch forever. A body, a mind, a soul can only carry so much before something tears. For me, that tear came suddenly, as if years of fear and anguish had been building toward one inevitable collapse. It began with the pain. At first it was a dull ache, something I tried to ignore. I told myself it was just fatigue, that perhaps I was falling ill. But soon it grew sharper, stealing my breath and twisting my stomach until I doubled over. My appetite vanished entirely. My hands trembled whenever I tried to eat, and food turned to ashes in my mouth. My skin paled and shadows deepened under my eyes. My teachers remarked that I seemed unwell. My mother urged me to rest. But the truth of my suffering remained unspoken. One night, after yet another encounter that left me hollow, I stumbled to my room clutching my side. The pain surged through me like fire, and I collapsed against the floorboards. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes. Time became meaningless. When at last I crawled to my bed, the sheets quickly stained with blood. At first, I thought I might die right there. Strangely, the thought did not frighten me. I whispered a prayer, half plea and half surrender, asking God to take me quickly. Anything, I thought, was better than enduring another day of silence. But dawn came, and with it the terrible realization that I was still alive. My mother noticed my pale face at breakfast, the way I winced when I sat down. She asked gentle questions, but I deflected them all. How could I explain the unexplainable? How could I reveal what I had been told no one would ever believe? I swallowed my pain and wore my silence like armor. Days later, the breaking point arrived. My mother left for town. My father was away, and I was alone in the house with the man I had come to fear. I tried to avoid him, but avoidance had become impossible. That afternoon, when it was over, I could barely stand. I crawled to the bathroom, clutching myself, and that was when the bleeding began in earnest. It was not the normal flow of a girl's monthly cycle. It was heavier, darker, accompanied by waves of pain that stole the strength from my limbs. My hands shook as I tried to clean myself, but there was too much blood. My body gave out, and I collapsed on the cold tile floor. The memory of that moment is burned into me. The faint hum of the bathroom light, the icy bite of the floor beneath my cheek, the way the world tilted and blurred until all I saw was red. I remember whispering, "Please God, not like this," before the darkness closed in. I do not know how long I lay there. When I came to, the house was quiet, and the light through the window had shifted. My heart raced with terror. If I could not stand, if I could not move, would anyone even find me? My breaths came shallow and quick, and tears slid silently down my face. For the first time, I felt certain I would not survive, but fate intervened. My father returned home earlier than expected from one of his trips. I did not hear him enter. I only felt his arms lifting me from the floor. His voice, usually steady and calm, shook as he called my name. The fear in his tone cut through the haze of my pain. I tried to whisper something, anything, but only a broken sound escaped my lips. He pressed a hand to my forehead, felt the dampness of blood on my clothes, and shouted for my mother. The rest is a blur of chaos. My mother's horrified gasp, the hurried steps through the house, the rush to the hospital. I remember lights above me, the beeping of machines, doctors speaking in urgent tones. Their words drifted in and out, but one phrase pierced through clearly: continued and violent abuse. I knew then that my silence could not protect him anymore. My body had spoken the truth for me. When I woke after surgery, my father was seated by my bed, his face gray with worry, his hands gripping mine as though he feared I might vanish. My mother stood nearby, her eyes swollen from crying. Neither asked questions immediately. Perhaps they could not bear to. I drifted in and out of sleep, my body fighting to heal, my mind circling the same thought. The secret is too heavy to carry any longer. But even then, even in that hospital room, the fear remained. When a kind woman, a nurse, perhaps a social worker, asked softly if I could tell her who hurt me, the words froze in my throat. My father's eyes searched mine, full of anguish, and still I could not speak. I told myself that if I revealed the truth, our family would break beyond repair, so I whispered a lie, that it was strangers on the road, men I did not know. The look in my father's eyes told me he wanted to believe, but his silence hinted at doubt. That night, alone in my hospital bed, I realized what it meant to be a prisoner of silence. It was not only about fear of not being believed. It was also about the unbearable weight of what the truth would do to the people I loved. My voice could destroy everything, and so I locked it away again, even as my body bore the evidence of what had been done. Still, something had changed. The secret was no longer entirely mine. Suspicion now hung in the air, and though I tried to bury it, I knew the day was coming when the silence would shatter completely. Secrets are heavy things. Once suspicion begins to stir, they cannot remain hidden forever. My silence, which I had thought would protect everyone, was unraveling. The hospital had raised questions that could not easily be dismissed. And though I tried desperately to keep the truth buried, It pushed against the walls of my heart until they cracked. In the days after my collapse, my mother hovered over me constantly. She fluffed my pillows, spooned broth to my lips, and stroked my hair with trembling hands. Her touch was tender, but her eyes held questions she did not dare voice. My father was quieter. He sat by the window, his shoulders tense, his jaw clenched. He asked few questions, but I could feel his suspicion growing. A silence of his own settled over him, and it terrified me. Doctors returned with hushed conversations, leaning over charts, using phrases like long-term trauma and repeated injury. My parents' faces shifted between confusion and grief. I wanted to vanish under the sheets. I thought if I stayed quiet long enough, the storm would pass, and life would return to the fragile balance it once knew. But storms do not pass without breaking something open. One evening, a woman I had seen before, not a nurse, but someone from the church, a sister who visited the hospital, came to my bedside. She carried no clipboard, asked no medical questions. She simply sat down and held my hand. Her eyes were gentle but piercing, as though she could see through the armor I had built. In a voice as soft as prayer, she asked, "Child, what burdens your soul?" I shook my head, tears filling my eyes. I wanted to tell her, but my grandfather's voice rang out louder in my memory. "No one will believe you. If you speak, everything will fall apart." My lips trembled, but I remained silent. She did not push. She only squeezed my hand and whispered, "The truth may hurt, but it is the only path to healing." Her words lingered in me long after she left. At home, the tension grew unbearable. My grandfather acted as though nothing had changed, visiting with gifts of fruit and flowers, speaking to my parents with his usual calm authority. My mother accepted it politely, but I could see the unease in her eyes. My father barely acknowledged him. The house, once full of familiar sounds, became a battlefield of unspoken suspicions. I tried to avoid him, but avoidance only fueled his anger. One night he cornered me in the hallway, his face close to mine, his whisper sharp as a knife. "If you tell them, you'll destroy your family," he hissed. His hand gripped my wrist until I winced. Fear rose in me like a tide, and for a moment I believed him. But my body was still healing, fragile and tender, and the memory of the hospital bed remained vivid. I could no longer pretend nothing was wrong. My silence was splitting apart. The breaking moment came during a family dinner. My mother passed me a plate, urging me to eat, but my stomach churned. My father's eyes lingered on me, then shifted to my grandfather. The air grew heavy until at last my father spoke, his voice low but unyielding. "Something happened to her, and I will not rest until I know what." The table fell silent. My fork clattered against the plate. My grandfather chuckled nervously, trying to brush it aside, but the sound rang hollow. My mother's eyes darted between us, her face pale. My hands shook, tears welling. And then, without planning it, without meaning to, the words slipped from my lips in a whisper. It was him. The room exploded. My mother gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. My father surged to his feet, fury twisting his features. My grandfather's mask cracked at last, his face contorting with rage and denial. He shouted, calling me a liar, insisting I was confused. But his words only deepened the truth already laid bare. I remember the chaos. My father lunging toward him, my mother sobbing, neighbors later arriving when the shouting spilled into the street. Police were called. Questions were asked. I sat frozen in my chair, trembling, as the storm I had feared for so long finally broke. The days that followed blurred into a haze of interrogations, accusations, and courtrooms. My grandfather insisted I had invented everything, weaving lies to destroy him. Some in the community believed him. Whispers spread, harsh and cutting. I was called confused, dramatic, even wicked. The shame burned deep, but I clung to the memory of my father's arms around me that first night, his voice trembling as he promised, "You are safe now." For the first time, I was no longer carrying the secret alone. It was terrifying and liberating all at once. The truth had burst from me like a storm, tearing apart the fragile walls of silence, leaving devastation in its wake. But in that devastation lay the possibility of freedom. I had imagined that speaking the truth would destroy me. Instead, it destroyed the lie. The cost was great. My family broken, our home shattered, whispers haunting us wherever we went. But somewhere deep inside, a spark of hope flickered. Perhaps at last, the healing could begin. When the storm of truth finally broke, it did not leave us whole. It tore through our family like a flood, leaving behind debris that could not be gathered again. My grandfather was gone from the house, yet his shadow lingered in every corner. My father's fury had not cooled. My mother's tears had not dried, and my own heart carried wounds that no medicine could heal. The whispers from neighbors were relentless. Some people avoided our family entirely, crossing the street rather than meeting our eyes. Others stared too long, their gazes heavy with judgment. Whispers floated through pews at church, words like troublemaker, ungrateful, and even liar. I learned that truth did not always bring freedom. Sometimes it brought exile. My parents, desperate to escape the eyes of the community, decided we would move to another town. I remember the day we left, the house stripped bare, boxes piled in the wagon, my mother clutching keepsakes to her chest. As we drove away, I looked back at the windows that had framed my childhood. They seemed dark and lifeless now, haunted by memories I wanted to erase. Our new home was smaller, set on the edge of another town where no one knew our story. My mother called it a fresh start. My father called it protection. To me it felt like exile, as though we had been driven out, carrying shame like a mark no one could see, but that I felt burning on my skin. At school I kept to myself. The other children laughed and played, but I hovered at the edges, never stepping fully into their circle. I had forgotten how to be carefree. When teachers praised my work, I forced a smile, but inside the emptiness remained. The silence had been broken, but the scars it left bound me still. It was in this new town that I first encountered the sisters at the local Catholic school. They walked with measured grace, their habits flowing like shadows of faith. Their voices were calm, their presence steady. I was drawn to them, though at the time I could not explain why. Perhaps it was their gentleness, or perhaps it was the way they seemed unshaken by the world's cruelty. One sister in particular noticed me. Her name was Sister Agnes, a woman with kind eyes that seemed to see past the walls I had built. She never pressed me with questions, but she lingered after class, asking if I needed help with my lessons, if I wanted to sit with her at lunch. At first I declined, wary of closeness, but slowly her patience began to thaw the ice around my heart. At home, things were fragile. My father worked long hours, his silence now heavy with unspoken guilt. My mother busied herself with chores, humming hymns as though singing could stitch the pieces of our family back together. We never spoke openly about what had happened. It was as though the truth had been spoken once and then locked away, too painful to touch again. Yet the absence of words did not erase the reality. It only deepened the shadows. I often felt like an intruder in my own life. Friends invited me to their homes, but I rarely went. I feared the questions their parents might ask, the pity in their eyes. I stayed instead within the narrow world of school and church, moving through each day as though walking through a fog. Nighttime was the hardest. In the dark, memories returned in sharp flashes. My grandfather's voice, the grip of his hand, the blood on the sheets. I woke from dreams trembling, my breath ragged, my heart racing. Sometimes I would kneel by the window and pray, though my prayers had grown faint and weary. I no longer asked for rescue. I asked only for strength to endure. It was Sister Agnes who first gave me a glimpse of something different. One afternoon she found me sitting alone under a tree, my schoolbooks unopened beside me. She sat down without a word, and we watched the sunlight filter through the leaves. After a long silence, she said quietly, "Sometimes shadows stay with us longer than we want, but even shadows cannot erase the light." Her words pierced me. I had never told her my story, yet it felt as though she understood. For the first time in months, I let myself cry in front of someone. She placed a hand on my shoulder and did not move it until my tears subsided. That simple gesture became a turning point, a reminder that though I lived in exile, I was not entirely alone. Still, the path ahead was steep. I could not shake the feeling of being marked, of carrying a shame that would never lift. My parents' silence weighed on me, and the community's whispers echoed in my ears, even in this new town. I wondered if I would ever truly belong anywhere again. Yet even in exile, seeds were being planted, seeds of resilience, seeds of faith that had not entirely died. Though I could not see it then, those seeds would one day grow into something strong enough to carry me through. For now, I lived in the shadows, navigating a world that felt both foreign and fragile. But within those shadows, a quiet light began to flicker. The light of kindness, the light of faith, the light of a God who had not abandoned me after all. Exile did not end my pain, but it gave me distance. And sometimes distance is what the soul needs before it can even imagine the possibility of healing. The whispers of neighbors no longer followed me in every street, though the echoes still lived in my mind. My parents spoke little about the past, as though silence could erase what had already been carved into our lives. Yet within that silence, small cracks opened, and through them, light began to seep in. It was Sister Agnes who watered the first seeds. She never forced me to speak, never demanded explanations. Instead, she offered presence, sitting with me under the tree in the schoolyard, walking beside me after lessons, giving me small tasks that reminded me I had purpose. Once, she asked me to help her polish the brass candlesticks for the chapel. As I rubbed away the tarnish, she said softly, "You see, even what is dulled can shine again, if you are patient." She was not speaking only of the candlesticks. I knew that. And though I did not answer, I felt her words take root. At night, my battles continued. Nightmares came without mercy, dragging me back into memories I wanted to bury. I woke drenched in sweat, my hands gripping the sheets as though to anchor myself to the present. But slowly I found ways to soothe myself. I learned to light a candle before bed, to kneel and whisper even the smallest prayer, "Lord, stay with me through this night." The act itself did not banish the dreams, but it reminded me that I was not entirely alone. Letters arrived sometimes, though not from friends or relatives. They came from the prison where my grandfather had been sent after the trial. My father collected them, sometimes leaving them unopened on the kitchen table, sometimes burning them in the fireplace without a glance. One day a letter slipped into my hands by accident, tucked among bills and papers. The handwriting was unmistakable, his. My heart pounded as I read the first line, "I am sorry." The words blurred before me. Sorry? Could such a word hold meaning after everything? He wrote of regret, of sleepless nights, of prayers for forgiveness. He begged me not to hate him. I folded the letter and tucked it away in a box, unable to respond, unable to destroy it. Days later I returned to it, my hands trembling. This time I did not keep it. I carried it into the yard, struck a match, and watched the flames devour his words. The ash scattered in the wind, leaving me shaken but strangely lighter. Burning that letter marked a shift. It did not erase what had happened, but it reminded me that I had choices. I could decide what to carry and what to let go. That small act planted the first real seed of strength within me. In school, I began to lean more into the presence of the sisters. Their discipline was steady but never cruel, their guidance firm but never crushing. They saw in me something I had forgotten I possessed, potential. Sister Agnes once told me, "The world tried to break you, but the Lord made you unbreakable." Those words lingered in me, carried like a secret talisman. It was not an overnight transformation. Healing rarely is. There were setbacks, days when despair swallowed me whole, when I refused to leave my bed, when the mirror reflected only scars and shadows. But there were also days when I felt almost like the child I once was, laughing quietly with another student, running in the schoolyard, singing hymns with something close to joy. Each day was a fragile balance, but slowly the balance shifted toward life. One spring morning, Sister Agnes asked me if I had ever considered a life of service, a vocation. I laughed at first, shaking my head. Me? A girl so broken, so marked by sorrow? She only smiled, saying, "Broken things can still carry light. In fact, sometimes they carry it best." Her words echoed in me for weeks. I began to imagine what it would mean to give my life not to silence, but to purpose, not to fear, but to faith. The thought frightened me, but it also filled me with a kind of peace I had not felt in years. At home, my parents noticed the change, though they did not fully understand it. My mother saw me studying scriptures late into the night and whispered to my father that perhaps I was finding my path. My father only nodded, his silence still heavy, but I caught a softness in his gaze I had not seen before. Perhaps he too dared to hope that I might be whole again. The decision did not come all at once. It came in fragments, in the flicker of a candle, in the warmth of Sister Agnes's hand on mine, in the quiet strength that grew each time I refused to let despair swallow me. Piece by piece, I began to see that my life was not over, that I was not defined solely by what had been done to me. By the time I was old enough to make the choice, I knew it was the only path that made sense. Joining the convent was not about running from my past. It was about reclaiming my future. It was about planting myself in soil that could nurture growth rather than suffocate it. The day I walked through the convent gates, my heart trembled with both fear and hope. I carried with me the scars of exile, the weight of shadows, but also the fragile beginnings of healing. I did not know then how long the journey would be, or how often the past would still whisper to me in the dark. But I knew one thing with certainty. The seeds of healing had been planted, and they were beginning to grow. When I entered the convent, I believed I was stepping into a place of refuge. I thought the stone walls and quiet corridors would keep the past at bay. What I discovered instead was that healing was not about escaping memories, but learning how to live with them, how to weave them into something greater than sorrow. Life in the convent was structured, every hour accounted for. At dawn the bells rang, summoning us to prayer. The chapel was cool and still, sunlight filtering through narrow windows as voices rose in unison. At first my own voice trembled, barely audible among the others. But slowly, with each passing day, I found strength in the rhythm. Prayer became not only a ritual but a rope I clung to, pulling myself back from the abyss. My duties were simple: tending to the gardens, helping in the kitchen, assisting in the classroom where young children came to learn. The garden quickly became my sanctuary. Kneeling in the soil, planting seeds, pulling weeds, I began to see reflections of myself. Growth takes patience, I realized. Roots must be nurtured in darkness before anything can bloom in the light. The children in the school became another balm. Their laughter, their curiosity, their small hands reaching for mine reminded me of the girl I once was before fear consumed me. Teaching them letters and prayers, I often felt tears prick my eyes, not from sadness, but from a kind of bittersweet gratitude. They were reminders of innocence, something I had lost, yet could still protect in others. Still, the shadows did not vanish. At night, nightmares returned, dragging me back into moments I longed to forget. I would wake in my narrow bed, heart racing, sheets damp with sweat. Sometimes I rose quietly and walked to the chapel, kneeling before the crucifix in the dim candlelight. "Help me carry this," I whispered into the silence. Those prayers did not erase the pain, but they gave me strength to endure it. Letters came again, though not as often. My grandfather wrote from prison, his words filled with pleas for forgiveness. I ignored most of them, but one letter struck me differently. In it, he admitted his guilt plainly, without excuses. He wrote that he was an old man, alone, haunted by his actions. He asked for nothing more than to know if I still lived. I sat with that letter for days, torn between anger and pity. In the end, I chose not to respond directly. Instead, I wrote one simple line on a piece of paper. I survived. I sent it without a name, without an address, only through the chaplain who delivered mail to the prison. Whether he ever received it, I will never know. But writing those words gave me a sense of closure I had long sought. As the years passed, I grew into my vocation. The veil no longer felt like a disguise, but a calling. I stood before classrooms filled with children, guiding them through lessons of faith, watching their eyes light up with discovery. I tended the sick in the infirmary, holding hands through pain, offering comfort where medicine could not. Each act of service stitched another piece of my broken self back together. There were moments of doubt, times when the weight of my past pressed so heavily that I questioned whether I belonged among women who seemed so whole. But Sister Agnes reminded me often, wholeness does not mean unbroken. It means offering even your broken pieces to God. Those words became my anchor. The convent itself began to feel like home. The echo of footsteps in the corridors no longer sounded like loneliness, but like the heartbeat of a shared life. The ringing of bells became music rather than command. In the stillness of the library, surrounded by the wisdom of generations, I discovered that my story, though scarred, had meaning. One spring morning, I found myself teaching a group of children about forgiveness. They listened wide-eyed as I explained that forgiveness does not mean forgetting, nor does it mean excusing what was wrong. Forgiveness, I told them, is a way of setting down a burden so it does not crush you. As I spoke, I realized I was speaking as much to myself as to them. My scars did not vanish. They never will. But I began to understand that scars are not only marks of pain, they are also evidence of survival. Each day I lived, each prayer I whispered, each lesson I taught was a testament to the fact that my grandfather had not destroyed me. I had chosen a different path, one of life and light. When I looked back on the girl I once was, the frightened child, the silent prisoner, the broken body in the hospital bed, I no longer saw only despair. I saw resilience. I saw the roots of a strength that had carried me here, into a life of faith and service. Building a new life in faith did not mean erasing my past. It meant transforming it, letting it shape me into someone who could stand before others and say, "You are not alone. Your pain does not define your future." That, more than anything, became my mission, and so the convent was not only my refuge, it was my rebirth. Within its walls, I discovered that healing is not the absence of scars, but the presence of hope. There comes a time when the past no longer feels like a chain, but more like a shadow. Shadows follow you, yes, but they do not control where you walk. As I sit now, older and steadier, I can look back without being consumed. The journey from silence to truth, from exile to healing, from despair to faith has left me marked, but it has also left me alive. And sometimes, being alive is the greatest triumph of all. I often think of that little girl, the one who once hid behind locked doors, trembling in fear. She did not know if she would survive, yet she did. She is still within me, her scars etched deep, but I no longer see her only as a victim. I see her as the beginning of a story of resilience. The convent where I now live has become more than walls and prayer. It is the place where I rebuilt myself, stone by stone, choice by choice. Each morning when the bells ring and voices rise in hymn, I feel the strength of survival humming in my chest. It is not the absence of pain that defines me, but the way I have chosen to carry it. When young girls come to me seeking counsel, I see the weight they sometimes hide in their eyes. They remind me of myself, though their stories may differ. I listen carefully, not with judgment, but with the understanding of someone who has walked through her own valley of shadows. I tell them gently, "You are not your wounds. You are more than what was done to you." I mean it every time, for I know how desperately I once needed to hear those words myself. There are still nights when memories return. Sometimes in dreams, sometimes in the quiet hours when the world is asleep, the echoes of my grandfather's voice, the weight of his threats, the feeling of being trapped, they surface, uninvited. But now I know what to do. I light a candle, whisper a prayer, and remind myself that those moments are over. He did not win. My scars prove only that I endured. Forgiveness is a word people often ask me about. Did I forgive him? Can such a thing be forgiven? I wrestled with that question for years. Forgiveness, I have learned, is not about excusing or erasing. It is about releasing yourself from carrying someone else's chains. I chose not to let hatred define me. I did not absolve him of what he did. I could not. But I let go of the power it had to consume me. That, to me, is forgiveness. When I think of my parents, my heart aches with complicated love. They did not see what was before them, but they also saved me when the truth finally surfaced. My father's fury, my mother's tears, those were proof that they loved me, even if they had been blind for too long. I have made peace with their imperfections, because I know now that we all carry limits in what we can bear to face. The years have softened some edges of my pain, but they have also sharpened my sense of purpose. I understand now that my story, though heavy, was not wasted. It shaped me into someone who can stand before others and say, "You can survive this too." That is a gift I could not have imagined in my darkest days. As I walk the convent gardens, I often pause by the roses. Their thorns remain sharp, but their blooms open wide to the sun. That is how I think of my own life. Thorns and beauty, sorrow and hope intertwined. Not one without the other, but both together making something whole. I linger there sometimes, running my fingers lightly across the petals, reminding myself that beauty and pain can exist side by side, and that both are part of the truth of living. I share all this not because I enjoy revisiting the pain, but because silence nearly destroyed me once. I know now that speaking, even in whispers, has the power to heal. Perhaps someone who hears my story will find the courage to let go of their own silence. If even one soul is spared the weight I carried, then every word is worth it. In the end, my life is not defined by my grandfather's cruelty, nor by the scars left behind. It is defined by the choices I made after, to speak, to heal, to forgive, to serve. Pain may have shaped me, but faith gave me the strength to rise again. So I stand here now, not broken, but whole in a different way. My voice, once silenced, has found its place. My story, once hidden, has become testimony, and my heart, once crushed by fear, beats with hope. If you take nothing else from my journey, take this. Even in the darkest night, light can be found. And though shadows may follow you, they do not decide where you walk. You do.